At 7:42 in the morning on March 3, 1943, Captain Ed Lerner was flying a B-25 Mitchell bomber at 50 feet above the Bismarck Sea, so low he could see the faces of Japanese sailors on the deck of the transport ship Kyokusei Maru. The ocean spray was hitting his windscreen. The smell of salt water and aviation fuel filled the cockpit. 14 50 caliber machine guns on his aircraft were about to open fire. Behind him, 11 more modified B-25s were coming in line abreast, a wall of lead 300 yards wide, bearing down on a Japanese convoy that had absolutely no idea what was about to hit them. The Japanese captain on the Kyokusei Maru saw the bombers at 2 miles out. He grabbed the bridge intercom and ordered hard to starboard. His voice was calm, professional. He'd been a merchant captain for 15 years. He'd survived the war this long by staying calm under pressure, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what was coming. Too late. Way too late. At 800 yards, Lerner's guns opened up. 1,700 rounds per minute. Combined fire from all 14 guns. The sound was like tearing sheet metal, but louder, angrier, more visceral. It was a sound that once you heard it, you never forgot it. The 50 caliber rounds walked across the water like a chainsaw cutting through lumber, then hit the ship's superstructure. The bridge windows exploded in a shower of glass and metal fragments. The anti-aircraft crews died at their guns before they could even traverse their weapons. The captain took 3 rounds through the chest and collapsed on the deck, blood pooling around him. He was dead before he hit the floor. 3 seconds later, Lerner's bombardier released 2 500-pound bombs at point-blank range. The bombs skipped across the water like stones on a pond, hit the hull below the waterline, and detonated inside the engine room. The explosion tore through the machinery spaces. Steel, bulkheads buckled, pipes burst, steam filled the compartments. The Kyokusei Maru was dead in the water 30 seconds after the Straffers arrived. Burning, listing to port, she'd sink in 40 minutes. And that was just the first ship. Just the opening act of what would become one of the most decisive battles in the Pacific War. By the end of that day, the entire Japanese convoy would be destroyed. 8 transport ships sunk. 4 destroyers sunk. Nearly 7,000 Japanese troops dead or missing. Men who would never see home again, never see their families again. Allied losses: 4 aircraft, 13 air crewmen killed. General MacArthur would call it one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. He wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't even close to exaggerating. But here's the thing that makes this story incredible, that makes it almost unbelievable. 6 months earlier, every engineer at Wright Field in Ohio had told the Army Air Force that the modifications on these B-25s were impossible. The airplanes wouldn't fly properly, the balance would be wrong, the aircraft would be too heavy, the structural integrity would be compromised. They recommended grounding every modified B-25 immediately, not studying them further, not conducting additional tests, grounding them, taking them out of service permanently. The man who proved them wrong was a 43-year-old naval officer turned Army Air Force captain named Paul Irwin Gunn. Everyone called him Pappy. And on August 17, 1942, when this story really begins, Pappy Gunn was crouched under the wing of a Douglas A-20 Havoc at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, Australia, watching mechanics weld 50 caliber machine guns into the bomber's nose, where the bombardier used to sit. The heat from the welding torch was intense in the Australian summer. Sweat was running down his face. His hands were covered in grease and metal filings. His wife and 4 children were trapped in a Japanese prison camp in Manila. The 5th Air Force was losing bombers faster than replacements arrived. And Pappy Gunn had an idea that was either brilliant or insane. Maybe both. Probably both. Let me back up and tell you why this matters, and why understanding what Pappy Gunn did changes everything we know about air combat in the Pacific. Because this isn't just a story about modified bombers. This is a story about innovation under pressure, about refusing to accept the conventional wisdom when the conventional wisdom is getting people killed. See, in July 1942, The war in the Southwest Pacific was going badly for the Allies. Real badly. Not things could be better badly. Not we're having some setbacks badly. We're talking we might actually lose this war badly. The Japanese controlled New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, most of the Dutch East Indies. They were reinforcing their positions at will, sending convoy after convoy of troops and supplies down from Rabaul. American bombers tried to stop them, tried hard, but high-altitude bombing against moving ships didn't work. The numbers didn't lie, and they were brutal. The 3rd Attack Group had lost 11 A-20 bombers in July alone trying to hit Japanese convoys from 15,000 feet. 11 aircraft. That's 11 crews. Somewhere between 44 and 55 men dead or missing. Men with families. Men with girlfriends back home. Men who'd written letters to their mothers the night before they died. The bombardiers couldn't hit moving ships. It wasn't their fault. They were good at their jobs, but the job was impossible. When they dropped lower to improve accuracy, the deck gunners shredded them. Captain Ed Lerner had watched 3 of his crews burn in the Coral Sea the previous week. Good men, friends. Men he'd had drinks with the night before, dead because the tactics didn't work and nobody knew how to fix it. The math was brutal and unforgiving. A B-17 Flying Fortress, dropping from 15,000 feet, would release its bombs about 4,000 feet horizontally from the target. Physics, simple physics. By the time those bombs fell through 3 miles of air, maybe 30 seconds of flight time, a ship moving at 15 knots would have traveled 300 feet. That's the length of a football field. The bombardier had to lead the target, account for wind, altitude, airspeed, temperature, humidity. Even experienced bombardiers were missing 80% of the time. Against stationary targets. Against moving ships? Forget it. You had better odds playing the lottery. But Paul Gunn had spent 21 years in the Navy before transferring to the Army Air Force. 2 decades of service. He understood ships. He understood how they moved, how they maneuvered, how their captains thought. He knew their limitations, their capabilities, their weaknesses, and he had a different idea. A radically different idea that would have gotten him laughed out of any planning meeting at Wright Field. What if bombers flew low enough to skip bombs across the water like stones? Point-blank range, 50 feet above the waves. So close, you could see the rust on the ship's hull. So close you couldn't miss even if you tried. The bombs would skip off the water, hit the ship's hull below the waterline where the armor was thinnest, and detonate inside the ship. Devastating, lethal, absolutely effective. In theory. Theory is one thing. Reality is something else entirely. But there was a problem, a big problem, a potentially fatal problem. To fly that close to enemy ships, you had to survive the approach. And at 50 feet, every deck gun on every ship would have a clear line of fire. Light anti-aircraft guns, heavy anti-aircraft guns, machine guns, even rifle fire. All of them pointing at you. All of them trying to kill you. You'd be flying straight into a wall of lead, a curtain of fire that would shred an aircraft in seconds, unless you killed the gun, crews first, unless you hit them so hard they never got a chance to fire back. That's where Pappy Gunn's idea got interesting. That's where it went from crazy to genius. What if you turned the bomber itself into a strafer? What if you mounted so many forward-firing guns on the aircraft that you could suppress every deck gun before they could fire back? What if you hit them so hard, so fast, with so much firepower that by the time they realized what was happening, you were already on top of them and it was too late? The A-20 Havoc had 4 .30 caliber machine guns in the nose. Standard configuration, adequate for strafing ground targets. Completely inadequate for attacking ships. 30 caliber rounds bounced off ship armor like hail. Like throwing rocks at a tank, Pappy Gunn needed 50 caliber guns. 4 of them, mounted where the bombardier sat, firing straight ahead. 1,700 rounds per minute combined. 50 caliber rounds would go through ship armor like it wasn't even there. They'd tear through steel plate, through bulkheads, through anything in their path. General George Kenney, the new 5th Air Force commander, liked the idea. He was one of the few senior officers willing to try something unconventional. He gave Gunn 1 week to prove the concept worked. 1 week. 7 days to modify an aircraft, test it, and demonstrate that it could actually do what Gunn claimed. Most projects like this would take months. Gunn had 7 days. Gunn was using 50 caliber guns, stripped from wrecked P-39 and P-40 fighters that wouldn't fly again, aircraft that had been shot down, crashed on landing, damaged beyond repair. The pilots were dead. The guns weren't. He mounted the guns on a steel frame inside the nose compartment. Each gun weighed 64 pounds. 4 guns, plus 200 pounds of ammunition in belted feeds. The weight shifted the center of gravity forward. Way forward. Too far forward for safe flight. The test flight almost killed the pilot. The A-20 barely climbed. It wanted to nose over, to dive straight into the ground. The pilot fought the stick the entire flight, using full back pressure just to keep the nose up. His arms were shaking from the effort by the time he landed. When he climbed out of the cockpit, he told Gunn the airplane was trying to kill him. Not joking, dead serious. The aircraft was unflyable in its current configuration. Gunn spent 2 days rebalancing the aircraft. 2 days of moving equipment, adjusting trim tabs, redistributing weight. He moved equipment aft. He adjusted the tail trim. He redistributed weight anywhere he could. The radio equipment went to the back. Extra ammunition was stored in the rear fuselage. Anything he could move, he moved. The second test pilot reported the plane flew like it was angry. But it flew. Barely. It flew. And when they test-fired the guns on a ground range, the results were spectacular. The 4 50 caliber guns tore through steel targets like tissue, paper, sheet metal just disintegrated. Imagine what they'd do to a ship's deck crew. On September 12, 1942, 16 modified A-22s hit the Japanese airfield at Buna on the north coast of New Guinea. The strafers came in at treetop level, wings nearly touching the jungle canopy, guns hammering. They destroyed 14 Japanese aircraft on the ground and suppressed every anti-aircraft position. The Japanese gunners didn't know what hit them. 0 A-22s lost. 0. Not a single aircraft, not a single casualty. The mission was a complete success. General Kenny wanted more. He wanted a lot more. But the A-20 had problems. Its range was too short to reach Japanese bases across the Owen Stanley Mountains. Its bomb load was too light to do serious damage to shipping. Gunn needed a bigger platform. The B-25 Mitchell. Longer range, heavier payload, more space for guns. More space for modifications, more potential. Now, before I go any further, let me tell you about the man behind these modifications. Because understanding Pappy Gunn means understanding why this wasn't just about tactics or technology. This was personal. This was about family. This was about a man who would do anything, risk anything, to save the people he loved. Paul Irwin Gunn was born in 1899 in Arkansas, rural Arkansas, poor Arkansas. He grew up hunting, fishing, working with his hands. He joined the Navy at 18, right at the end of World War I. He served on destroyers, learned about ships, learned about the sea. He stayed in the service through the 20s and 30s, rose through the ranks, became an expert in naval operations. By 1941, he'd retired from the Navy after 21 years of service and was living in Manila with his wife Polly and their 4 children. He'd started Philippine Airlines before the war, flying inter-island routes with a handful of Beechcraft planes, 5 aircraft. Small operation, but it was his. He'd built it from nothing. When the Japanese invaded the Philippines in December 1941, Gunn tried to evacuate his family. He tried everything he could think of. Too late. The Japanese moved too fast. They captured Manila before he could get them out. Polly and the 4 kids ended up in Santo Tomas internment camp. Thousands of Allied civilians packed into a small compound with inadequate food, inadequate water, inadequate medical care. Gunn got out barely, flying one of his own planes to Australia with Japanese fighters on his tail. He immediately rejoined the military. This time the Army Air Force, because he knew the road back to Manila went through New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Every mission he flew took him one step closer to his family. Every Japanese position destroyed, every ship sunk, every airfield bombed brought him closer to the day he could walk into that internment camp and bring his family home. So when Gunn was working 18-hour days modifying bombers, when he was test flying aircraft that other pilots said were unflyable, when he was pushing himself and his crews to the edge of exhaustion and beyond, it wasn't just about winning the war. It was about getting his family back. And that kind of motivation, that kind of desperate determination, makes a man do extraordinary things, makes a man refuse to accept impossible as an answer. In December 1942, Gunn pulled the bombardier and nose guns from a B-25C Mitchell and installed 4 50 caliber guns in the nose, 4 more in external cheek packs on the fuselage, and rotated the top turret forward so it could fire ahead, 10 forward-firing guns. Then he added 2 more on each side, 14 guns total, 215 pounds of lead per second when all guns fired simultaneously. That's not a typo. 215 pounds of projectiles every single second. The sound alone was enough to terrify anyone on the receiving end. The ground crew called it Pappy's folly. They thought Gunn had lost his mind. They didn't think it would work. They were wrong. Very wrong. If you're enjoying this story and you want to hear more incredible, forgotten tales from World War II, do me a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button. Seriously. I'm not just saying that because everyone says it. I'm saying it because stories like Pappy Gunn's deserve to be remembered, and the algorithm only shows this content to more people when you subscribe and engage. These aren't just war stories about planes and bombs and tactics. These are stories about regular people who did extraordinary things under impossible circumstances. People who innovated, who adapted, who refused to give up even when the experts told them it couldn't be done. And if you're a veteran, or you have family members who served, you know how important it is to keep these memories alive. You know what it means when someone's sacrifice gets forgotten. So subscribe. Help us share these stories. Help us make sure these men don't disappear into history. All right, back to Pappy. Gunn flew the prototype B-25 to Charters Towers in northern Australia to demonstrate it to the 3rd Attack Group. The flight took 3 hours. The plane was nose-heavy the entire time. It wanted to drop out of the sky on takeoff. He had to use full back pressure on the stick just to keep it level. His arms were burning by the time he landed. The engines strained under the extra weight. The flight characteristics were all wrong. Every aeronautical engineering textbook said this aircraft shouldn't fly. But once airborne, once you got it stable, the B-25 was a flying destroyer. Point the nose at a target, pull the trigger, and watch that target disappear under a curtain of 50 caliber fire. It was devastating. It was beautiful. It was exactly what the 5th Air Force needed. General Kenny ordered 12 more conversions immediately. The 81st Air Depot Group in Townsville worked 18-hour days to modify every available B-25. Mechanics working in the brutal Australian heat, welding gun mounts, installing ammunition feeds, rebalancing aircraft. By February 1943, they had 30 strafers ready for combat, 30 aircraft that weren't supposed to exist, that every engineer said couldn't work. Then Kenny sent the blueprints to Wright Field in Ohio. The Army Air Force engineers were the best in the world. MIT graduates, Caltech graduates, men who'd spent their entire careers designing aircraft. Men with advanced degrees in aeronautical engineering, structural mechanics, fluid dynamics. They studied Gunn's modifications for 3 days, 72 hours of analysis. Then they sent a message back to Australia that basically said, "This is impossible. The modifications were impractical. The balance would be wrong. The airplane would be too heavy. It wouldn't fly properly. The structural stress would cause metal fatigue and catastrophic failure." They had charts and graphs and calculations to prove it. They recommended grounding every modified B-25 immediately, not testing them further, not conducting more analysis, grounding them, taking them out of service, scrapping them if necessary. General Kenny was in Washington when that message arrived. He walked into General Hap Arnold's office, where the Wright Field engineers were waiting to explain why Pappy Gunn's gunship was impossible. They had a presentation prepared, slides, technical drawings, mathematical proofs. Kenny looked at them and said, 12 of these impossible airplanes just played the key role in destroying a Japanese convoy in the Bismarck Sea. Every transport sunk. Every destroyer crippled. 60 more strafers are already being modified in Australia. They're flying combat missions right now while you're telling me they can't fly. The room went silent. The engineers looked at each other. Nobody knew what to say. General Arnold, chief of the Army Air Forces, practically ran the engineers out of his office. Sometimes reality trumps theory. Sometimes the guy in the field with grease under his fingernails knows more than the guy with the degree on the wall. Sometimes you just have to build it and see if it works. But let me tell you about the Battle of Bismarck Sea, because this is where everything came together. This is where Pappy Gunn's impossible gunship proved it could change the entire course of the war in the Pacific. This is where theory became reality in the most violent way possible. It started with intelligence intercepts on February 28, 1943. Allied codebreakers in Melbourne had decrypted Japanese naval messages. They'd broken the Japanese naval code months earlier, but they kept it secret, letting the Japanese think their communications were secure. A convoy was leaving Rabaul, 8 transport ships, 8 destroyer escorts, nearly 7,000 Japanese troops bound for Lae on New Guinea's north coast. Troops, supplies, ammunition, heavy weapons, everything needed to reinforce the Japanese garrison and launch a new offensive. General Kenny had 72 hours to stop them, 3 days. After that, those troops would be ashore, dug in, and impossible to dislodge without a major ground campaign that would cost thousands of American lives. The convoy route crossed the Bismarck Sea between New Britain and New Guinea, 400 miles of open water. Japanese commanders believed bad weather would shield them. They'd timed the convoy to take advantage of monsoon season. March was monsoon season in the Southwest Pacific. Low clouds, heavy rain, poor visibility. Allied bombers couldn't hit what they couldn't see. It was solid tactical thinking based on sound operational experience. They were right about the weather. They were absolutely wrong about the bombers. On March 2nd, reconnaissance aircraft spotted the convoy steaming south through the Vitiaz Strait. B-17 Flying Fortresses attacked from 15,000 feet through cloud breaks. 21 heavy bombers. They dropped 137 bombs. 500-pound general-purpose bombs, 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs. They claimed multiple hits. The crews were certain they'd sunk at least 2 transports. Post-battle analysis showed they sank nothing. Not one ship, not one hit. High-altitude bombing against moving ships didn't work. The numbers proved it. The dead crews proved it. The Japanese convoy kept coming, steaming south at 15 knots. On schedule, the Japanese commanders were confident now. The American bombers had tried and failed. The convoy would reach Lae by dawn on March 4th. They'd unload the troops under fighter cover from the airfield at Lae. The war in New Guinea would turn in Japan's favor. They'd push the Allies back, retake Port Moresby, threaten Australia itself. That night, Captain Ed Lerner briefed the 92nd Bomb Squadron at Port Moresby. The briefing room was hot, crowded, filled with cigarette smoke. 12 B-25 strafers, 30 modified A-20 Havocs, Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters for top cover, P-38 Lightnings to handle Japanese Zeros. The strafers would attack at masthead height, 50 feet above the water. Gun range, point blank. The plan was simple on paper. Overwhelm the deck guns with concentrated firepower. Skip bomb the ships while they were stunned. Get out before the Zeros arrived. Simple on paper. In reality, they were going to fly into the most concentrated anti-aircraft fire anyone had ever seen. Lerner had flown one practice mission using this tactic. 1. His navigator, a kid from Iowa who looked about 16, asked what happened if the strafer took fire during the approach, if the guns jammed, if the bombs hung up, if the aircraft got hit. Lerner said they'd find out tomorrow. Nobody laughed. The briefing ended at 2200 hours. Nobody slept. Men wrote letters home. Letters that started, "If you're reading this." Letters that would be mailed if they didn't come back. At 0630 on March 3rd, the strike force assembled over Cape Ward Hunt. 137 aircraft. The biggest strike package the 5th Air Force had ever put together. The B-17 seconds would attack first, from altitude, to draw the defensive fire high, to make the Japanese look up. Then the strafers would come in low. By the time the Japanese looked down, it would be too late. The Japanese convoy was 70 miles northwest of Leh when the B-17 seconds arrived. 8 transports in 2 columns, destroyers screening on the flanks and ahead. The heavy bombers attacked through scattered clouds. The transports opened fire with every gun they had. 25mm anti-aircraft guns, 13mm machine guns, the sky filled with black puffs of anti-aircraft fire. One B-17 took flak damage to the number 3 engine and turned back, trailing smoke. The rest pressed the attack. The bombs fell, whistling, down through 3 miles of air. Most missed. The transports kept steaming. The deck crews were focused upward, scanning the clouds for more high-altitude bombers. Then the strafers arrived. Lerner led the B-25 seconds in from the southeast at wavetop height. The sun was behind them, making them hard to see. 14 forward-firing guns per aircraft. 168 guns total across 12 strafers. They came in line abreast, a wall of firepower 300 yards wide. Flying so low, the propeller wash was kicking up spray from the ocean surface. The Japanese crews on the transport ships couldn't believe what they were seeing. Bombers didn't fly that low. Bombers attacked from altitude. This was wrong. This violated every rule they knew. The Japanese crews on the Kyokusei Maru saw them at 2 miles. 2 miles doesn't sound like much, but at 240 knots closing speed, it's about 30 seconds. The ship's captain, a veteran of 20 years at sea, ordered hard to starboard, trying to present the smallest possible target. The crew manning the deck guns started to traverse their weapons, trying to track the incoming bombers, hands moving fast, training kicking in. They had maybe 15 seconds to get organized, get their guns pointed in the right direction, and start firing. 15 seconds to set up, acquire targets, and defend their ship. They didn't get 15 seconds. They didn't even get 10. At 800 yards, less than half a mile, the B-25 seconds opened fire. All 12 aircraft simultaneously. The sound was unlike anything anyone on those ships had ever heard. Like the end of the world. Like God himself tearing the sky apart. Imagine standing next to a jackhammer, but multiply that by 1,000. The 50 caliber rounds walked across the water like a chainsaw cutting through steel, creating a visible line of splashes that marched directly toward the ship. Hundreds of rounds per second, thousands of rounds in the air simultaneously. Then the rounds hit the superstructure. Metal screamed. Steel plate buckled. The bridge windows exploded in a shower of glass and twisted metal. The anti-aircraft crews died at their guns, cut down before they could fire a single shot. Bodies torn apart by 50 caliber rounds, traveling at 2,800 feet per second. The ship's captain took 3 rounds through the chest and fell. Blood sprayed across the chart table. The executive officer tried to give orders, tried to take command, but the radio room was already on fire and nobody could hear him over the sound of tearing metal. In 3 seconds, maybe 4, the command structure of the Kyokusei Maru ceased to exist. The ship was effectively dead, even though it would take 40 minutes to sink. 3 B-25 seconds dropped their bombs at 100 yards. Point-blank range. The bombardiers could see individual faces on the deck. The first bomb, a 500-pound general-purpose bomb with a delayed fuse, skipped off the water like a stone on a pond. It hit the hull 3 feet below the waterline, penetrated the thin hull plating, and detonated inside the engine room. The explosion tore through the machinery spaces, destroyed the main engines, killed everyone in the engineering department instantly, and flooded 3 compartments. Steam and smoke poured from the vents. The second bomb hit amidships, blowing a hole 20 feet across in the side of the ship. The third bomb missed, skipping past the ship and detonating in the water beyond. The Kyokusei Maru was dead in the water 30 seconds after the strafers arrived. 30 seconds, half a minute. The ship was burning in 4 places, listing 15 degrees to port, taking on water. The ship would sink in 40 minutes, settling slowly by the stern, taking 800 Japanese soldiers down with her. And that was just the first transport, just the opening act. The transport Teo Maru tried to run. The captain, a merchant marine veteran who'd survived 3 years of war, pushed the engines to full speed, 15 knots maximum. Merchant ships weren't fast. They were built for cargo capacity, not speed. The B-25 strafers were doing 240 knots. The math was simple, brutal, and unforgiving. 4 strafers bracketed the Teo Maru from both sides, 2 from port, 2 from starboard. The 50 caliber streams converged on the deck like crossfire from 2 machine gun nests. Caught in a crossfire with nowhere to hide, the anti-aircraft crews died at their guns. The bridge windows shattered. The ship's executive officer took 3 rounds through the chest and collapsed on the deck, blood pooling beneath him. The captain lasted another 10 seconds, trying to steer his ship to safety, before a burst of fire cut him down. He died holding the wheel, his hands still gripping the spokes. The strafers dropped 8 bombs total. 5 hit. The ship broke in half, the keel snapping like a twig. Japanese soldiers were below decks. When the hull split open, most never made it topside. They were trapped in compartments that were flooding, in darkness, in chaos, screaming for help that would never come. The transport sank in 6 minutes. Survivors jumped into the Bismarck Sea wearing full combat gear. The packs and equipment dragged them under. The water was full of men thrashing, drowning, disappearing beneath the waves. Within 20 minutes, there were no survivors visible. Australian bowfighters strafed the decks of the destroyer Shikanami as it tried to screen the transports. The destroyer's anti-aircraft fire hit one bowfighter, 20mm shells tearing through the wing. The Australian pilot kept coming, blood running down his face from a head wound, vision blurred. His forward guns raked the destroyer's deck from bow to stern. The Japanese gun crews went down, cut to pieces. When the B-25 strafers arrived seconds later, Shikanami had no defense. The gun crews were dead or wounded. The ship was effectively defenseless. 3 strafers attacked from different angles simultaneously. The destroyer captain tried to turn into the attack, tried to present the smallest possible target, tried to maneuver. Too slow. Way too slow. Bombs hit port side, starboard side, and amidships. The destroyer didn't sink immediately, but it was finished, dead in the water. Fires spreading through 3 decks. The crew abandoned ship 2 hours later, jumping into the sea with no hope of rescue. Most would drown before nightfall. By 0900 hours on March 3rd, less than 3 hours after the attack began, the Japanese convoy was scattered across 40 square miles of ocean, 5 transports sinking or burning, 2 destroyers crippled, oil slicks spreading across the water, debris everywhere, bodies floating in the swells. The remaining ships tried to make lay. They didn't make it. The strafers returned at 1400 hours, with fresh bombs and full ammunition loads. No mercy, no quarter. The Japanese had no fighter cover. The Zeros had landed at Leh to refuel 2 hours earlier. They were on the ground, being serviced, when the second wave arrived. The pilots ran for their aircraft, but they were too late. The transport Io Maru took 12 bomb hits in the second attack, 12 500-pound bombs in less than 2 minutes. The ship's magazine detonated. The explosion was massive, visible from Port Moresby, 130 miles away. A mushroom cloud rose 3,000 feet into the air. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left. No wreckage, no survivors, No evidence the ship had ever existed. 1,800 Japanese soldiers gone in 3 seconds. Vaporized. Captain Ed Lerner's strafer came in low over the transport Oigawa Maru on the second pass. His co-pilot, a lieutenant from Texas, counted 14 separate fires on the deck. Japanese soldiers were jumping overboard, choosing the sea over the flames. Men on fire were throwing themselves into the water. The anti-aircraft guns were silent, their crews dead or fled. Lerner's bombardier, released at point-blank range, so close he could see the ship's name painted on the bow. 2 bombs, both hit. The transport settled by the stern and capsized, rolling over slowly like a dying whale, trapping hundreds of men inside the hull. You could hear them screaming, banging on the metal, trying to get out. The sound haunted Lerner for the rest of his life. The modified A-20 Havocs hunted the crippled destroyers like wolves pursuing wounded prey. The destroyer Asashio tried to rescue survivors from the water, pulling men aboard as fast as they could. It was the humanitarian thing to do. It was also the last thing they ever did. 3 A-22s attacked from different directions simultaneously. The destroyer's crew was focused on rescue operations, leaning over the rails, pulling exhausted men from the water. They never saw the strafers until the guns opened fire. They never had a chance. Asashio took bomb hits on the forward deck and bridge. The fires couldn't be controlled. Water mains were cut. Firefighting equipment was destroyed. The destroyer burned through the night and sank at dawn on March 4th. By the evening of March 3rd, the entire Japanese convoy was destroyed, annihilated. 8 transports sunk. 4 destroyers sunk. Of the nearly 7,000 Japanese troops that left Rabaul 3 days earlier, fewer than 1,200 reached Leh, and most of them were wounded. 2,700 were rescued by destroyers and returned to Rabaul. The rest died in the Bismarck Sea, drowned, burned, blown apart. Allied losses? 4 aircraft, 1 B-17, 3 P-38 seconds, 13 air crewmen killed. The exchange ratio was almost comical if it wasn't so deadly serious. 7,000 Japanese dead for 13 Americans. The Japanese had lost an entire division's worth of troops, along with all their equipment, all their supplies, all their heavy weapons, all their ammunition. The Americans had lost 4 airplanes out of 137, a 3% loss rate. Acceptable, more than acceptable, miraculous. General MacArthur called it one of the most complete and annihilating combats of all time. He wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't even close to exaggerating. The Battle of Bismarck Sea changed the strategic situation in the Southwest Pacific overnight. The Japanese never again attempted to reinforce New Guinea by convoy. The war in the Southwest Pacific had turned, and it turned because of Pappy Gunn's impossible gunship. Now, here's something most people don't know about the Battle of Bismarck Sea, something that makes this story even more remarkable. Back in Australia, while the battle was raging, the Wright Field engineers were drafting their formal report explaining why the B-25 modifications couldn't possibly work. They were writing a detailed technical analysis proving, with mathematics and aerodynamic theory and structural stress calculations, that Pappy Gunn's strafers were aerodynamically unsound and structurally unsafe. They had charts, they had graphs, they had wind tunnel data from similar configurations. They were proving, scientifically, that the aircraft destroying a Japanese convoy at that very moment couldn't exist. General Kenny sent a message to General Hap Arnold in Washington on March 5th, 2 days after the battle. The subject line read, "Commerce Destroyer Modifications Approved for Production." The body of the message contained one paragraph, one brutally simple paragraph. 12 B-25 strafers just destroyed an entire Japanese convoy. Request immediate factory integration of forward gun package into all B-25 production aircraft. Arnold called North American Aviation's president, J.H. Dutch Kindleberger, that afternoon. Kindleberger said his engineers needed to see the modifications, needed to study them, needed to understand what Gunn had done. Arnold said he was sending the man who designed them. Pappy Gunn was going to California, not to consult, not to advise, to teach the engineers how to build his airplane. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I am, let me ask you to do something real quick. Hit that like button. I know, everyone asks for likes. But here's why it actually matters, and I'm going to be straight with you. YouTube's algorithm decides what to recommend to people based on engagement, likes, comments, shares, watch time. If you like this video, if you interact with it, YouTube shows it to more people who are interested in World War II history. More people learn about Pappy Gunn and the men who flew these missions. More people understand what these guys did. These stories don't get taught in schools anymore. They're not in the textbooks. When I was in school, World War II was maybe 2 weeks of study, and we never heard about guys like Pappy Gunn. The only way these stories survive is if people like you and me keep sharing them, keep engaging with them, keep telling the algorithm that this content matters. So hit that like button. Help us keep these memories alive. All right, back to the story. Pappy Gunn didn't want to leave Australia. He fought the order. His wife Polly and their 4 children were still in Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. The Japanese had held them since January 1942, 14 months in captivity. 14 months of not knowing if they were alive or dead, if they were healthy or sick, if they were being treated well or brutalized. Gunn flew every mission hoping he'd get closer to liberating the Philippines, closer to kicking the door down at Santo Tomas and bringing his family home. Going to California meant going in the wrong direction, thousands of miles away from his family, away from the fight, away from the war that mattered to him personally. General Kenny made it an order, not a request, an order. The 5th Air Force needed factory-built strafers, hundreds of them, thousands of them if possible. Gunn was the only man who could show North American aviation how to do it right, how to do it safely, how to build these modifications into production aircraft. The general promised Gunn would be back in the Pacific within 6 weeks, 42 days maximum. Kenny kept his promises. Gunn knew that. He packed his bag. Gunn landed in Long Beach, California on March 27, 1943. The North American Aviation Plant covered 140 acres of industrial space, 20,000 workers on 3 shifts running 24 hours a day. The assembly line produced 1 complete B-25 every 4 hours, 6 aircraft per day, 42 per week. It was an industrial marvel, a testament to American manufacturing capability, to what happens when an entire nation mobilizes for war. The factory engineers studied Gunn's hand-drawn blueprints laid out on a conference table. These were MIT graduates, men with advanced degrees in aeronautical engineering, men who'd spent years studying aircraft design. They asked about stress calculations, about load factors, about fatigue life. Gunn said he didn't have any calculations. He just built the thing and flown it until it worked. They asked about wind tunnel testing, about aerodynamic modeling, about computational analysis. Gunn said he'd tested it by flying it in combat against people who were trying to kill him. Real-world testing, the most honest kind. They asked about the center of gravity problem, about stability and control, about how he'd managed to make the aircraft flyable. Gunn showed them where he'd moved the radio equipment aft to compensate, where he'd adjusted the tail trim, where he'd redistributed weight until the numbers worked. One engineer, a guy who'd probably never been closer to combat than a movie theater, said the modifications would buckle the fuselage skin around the cheek gun mounts. The muzzle blast from the .50 caliber guns would peel the aluminum right off the airframe. Vibration, heat, stress concentration. Gunn said it did peel the aluminum. He'd seen it happen on the first test firing. Then he showed them the blast tubes he'd welded to the gun mounts to extend the muzzle flash beyond the propeller arc and protect the fuselage skin. Problem solved. Field expedient engineering. The engineer looked at the blast tubes, looked at Gunn, and probably realized he was dealing with someone who thought differently than anyone he'd ever met. Someone who solved problems by building solutions, not by calculating why solutions couldn't exist. The factory engineers spent 2 weeks reverse engineering Gunn's field modifications into production drawings. into specifications that could be replicated on an assembly line. They strengthened the nose structure with additional formers and stringers. They redesigned the gun mounts to handle the recoil loads. They added heavier gauge aluminum patches to reinforce the fuselage skin around high-stress areas. They calculated the exact center of gravity shift and adjusted the tail trim accordingly, adding fixed trim tabs that would be part of every production aircraft. They turned Gunn's field expedient modifications, his late-night improvisations, into something that could be mass-produced on an assembly line by workers who'd never seen combat. The first factory-built B-25G Strafer rolled off the assembly line on May 10, 1943. 4 50 caliber guns in the solid nose. And here's where it gets even more interesting, where the engineers started adding their own improvements. They added a 75mm M4 cannon in the forward fuselage, mounted below and slightly behind the machine guns. The same cannon used in the M3 Lee tank, a weapon designed to punch through armor plate. One shell from that cannon could hole a destroyer below the waterline, could penetrate the engine room, could cripple a ship with a single hit. Gun test flew the prototype at Edwards Air Force Base. The 75mm cannon recoiled 4 feet when fired, the entire gun assembly sliding backward on rails. The entire aircraft shuddered, bucked like a horse trying to throw its rider. The navigator had to manually reload the cannon between shots, a process that was difficult and dangerous and exhausting while the aircraft was maneuvering and taking fire. Rate of fire: 1 round every 30 seconds if you were good, longer if you weren't. Gunn told the engineers it would work for ships. Maybe not for anything faster, anything that could maneuver, but for ships it would be devastating. North American Aviation built 400 B-25G Strafers. Then they improved the design, learning from combat reports, from pilot feedback, from what worked and what didn't. The B-25H added 4 more 50 caliber guns in the cheek packs. 8 guns in the nose, 4 in the cheeks, 2 in the top turret rotated forward. 14 forward-firing guns total, the same configuration Gunn had pioneered. The H model kept the 75mm cannon, but added a better recoil system, a pneumatic buffer that absorbed some of the shock. The navigator could reload faster, and the rate of fire increased to 1 round every 20 seconds. Then they built the ultimate version, the aircraft that would become legendary. The B-25J removed the 75mm cannon entirely and added 4 more 50 caliber guns, 18 forward-firing guns. Let me say that again. 18 forward-firing guns on a single aircraft, the most heavily armed production bomber in history. More firepower than many destroyers. North American Aviation built 4,900 B-25Js. They delivered the first ones to the Pacific in October 1943, and they kept delivering them until the war ended. Gunn returned to Australia in May 1943, 6 weeks after he'd left, exactly as General Kenny had promised. 42 days. His family was still in Manila. The intelligence reports from Santo Tomas internment camp were getting worse every month. Food rations had been cut to near starvation levels. Medicine was running out. Prisoners were dying from malnutrition and disease, from dysentery and beriberi and tropical infections that would have been treatable with proper medical care. The Japanese camp commander had informed the Red Cross that all prisoners would be executed if Allied forces approached Manila. It wasn't a bluff. The Japanese had done it before in other camps. Gunn told General Kenny he wanted to fly the first mission over Manila when the liberation came. Kenny promised he could. It was the least he could do. The strafers kept hunting through 1943 and into 1944. In April 1943, B-25 seconds destroyed 16 Japanese barges carrying troops and supplies near Finschhafen. In May, they sank 12 cargo ships at Wewak Harbor in a dawn raid. In June, they hit the oil facilities at Balikpapan on Borneo, leaving the refinery in flames and destroying months of fuel stockpiles. The Japanese stopped moving supplies by ship in daylight. Too dangerous. The strafers owned the daylight hours. It didn't help. The strafers learned to attack at night using radar, using the new technology that was just becoming available. They learned to skip bomb from 50 feet in complete darkness, navigating by instruments, trusting the radar operator's directions. They learned to coordinate with PT boats that illuminated targets with searchlights at the last second, creating a split-second window for attack before the boats cut their lights and vanished into the darkness. The Japanese called the modified B-25 seconds the Black Death. They weren't wrong. They weren't exaggerating. The strafers were hunting them around the clock, day and night, and there was nowhere to hide, nowhere safe. The ocean that had protected them was now their graveyard. On November 2nd, 1943, Major Lynn Fridge led 4 squadrons of strafers into Rabaul Harbor in the most ambitious attack yet planned. 137 Allied aircraft total, 59 B-25 seconds loaded with bombs and ammunition. The harbor held 38 Japanese vessels, cruisers, destroyers, tankers, cargo ships, minesweepers, patrol boats. It was the largest concentration of Japanese shipping in the Southwest Pacific, gathered in one place, and the Allies were going to destroy it in one coordinated strike. The strafers came in at masthead height through phosphorus smoke that blinded the anti-aircraft gunners, that burned their eyes and made them cough. They attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, from north and south and east, overwhelming the defenses. The Japanese couldn't track them all. They didn't know where to shoot. In 15 minutes of sustained attack, 30 ships were hit, burning, sinking. 5 sunk outright, disappearing beneath the waves. 12 damaged beyond repair, never to sail again. The rest were limping, barely floating, trying to reach shore before they sank. Rabaul Harbor was finished as a forward supply base. The Japanese would never recover. Pappy Gunn flew that mission personally. He was 44 years old, too old to be flying combat by most standards. He didn't have to fly. He was a special projects officer, headquarters staff, a technical consultant. But his family was still in Manila, and every mission took him closer. Every Japanese ship sunk weakened the enemy. Every Japanese base destroyed brought liberation closer. Every ship sunk, every airfield destroyed, every Japanese position neutralized brought the liberation of the Philippines one step closer. The strafers evolved through 1944 as the war intensified. Some carried 8 5-inch high-velocity rockets under the wings, armor-piercing warheads that could sink a destroyer with a single hit. Some carried napalm tanks, jellied gasoline that stuck to everything it touched and burned at 2,000 degrees. Some carried paradrag bombs, small fragmentation bombs with parachutes that allowed the B-25 to drop them from minimum altitude without catching itself in the blast, without destroying itself with its own weapons. The most effective tactic was the combined strike. High-level B-24 liberators would bomb from 20,000 feet to force the defenders to look up, to make them think the attack was coming from above. Then the strafers would come in low, hugging the waves. By the time the gunners looked down, by the time they realized their mistake, the B-25 seconds were already on them, and it was too late. Always too late. In the first 8 months of 1944, 5th Air Force strafers destroyed 947 Japanese aircraft on the ground. They sank 273 ships of all types. They killed an estimated 38,000 Japanese soldiers, not counting those who died on sinking ships, not counting those who drowned in the ocean. The modified B-25 seconds had become the decisive weapon in the Southwest Pacific campaign, the weapon that turned the tide, the weapon that made invasion possible. Gunn added his own modifications as the war progressed, never satisfied, always tinkering. He mounted additional fuel tanks to extend the range, to let the strafers hit targets further from base. He improved the gun cooling systems to prevent overheating during sustained fire. He developed new ammunition loading techniques that increased the rate of fire by 20%. Some B-25 seconds in the Pacific carried modifications that existed nowhere else, that weren't in any manual, that weren't approved by any engineer. Because Gunn had invented them the night before, a mission while lying in his bunk, unable to sleep, thinking about his family. He was constantly tinkering, constantly improving, constantly looking for ways to make the aircraft more effective, more lethal, more survivable. Other theater commanders wanted strafers desperately. General Kenny sent them blueprints, sent them specifications, sent them everything they needed to build their own. The Mediterranean theater modified B-25 seconds for anti-shipping missions against German convoys supplying North Africa. The China-Burma-India theater modified B-25 seconds to attack Japanese supply lines along the Burma Road. The concept Gunn had proven in Brisbane spread across every combat zone, adapted to local conditions, to local enemies, to local targets. It became doctrine. It became standard operating procedure. On October 20th, 1944, American forces landed at Leyte in the Philippines. The liberation of Manila was coming. 3 months away, maybe 4. The liberation of Manila was 3 months away at most. Gunn's family had been in captivity for nearly 3 years, almost 1,000 days. He was flying multiple missions every day now, sometimes 3 or 4 missions in 24 hours, running himself to exhaustion. He told his crew chief, a sergeant from Oklahoma who'd been with him since Brisbane, that he wouldn't stop until his family was free. The crew chief believed him. Everyone believed him. Then the Japanese bombed Tacloban airfield in a surprise night raid. The Japanese bombers hit Tacloban airfield on November 27, 1944, at 0330 hours, while most of the base was sleeping. 56 aircraft, Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers escorted by Zero fighters. They came in low from the north, under the radar coverage, flying at wave-top height until the last possible moment. The radar operators saw them too late to scramble interceptors, too late to sound the alarm properly. Gunn was in the operations tent reviewing mission plans for the morning strike, planning the next day's attacks, when the first bombs hit. The tent was 200 yards from the main runway, close enough to coordinate with operations, close enough to talk to pilots as they landed, too close to survive a direct attack. The blast wave knocked him off his feet, threw him across the tent. Shrapnel tore through the canvas walls like bullets. A fragment hit Gunn in the left leg, cutting deep into the muscle, severing blood vessels. Another fragment hit his shoulder, lodging near the bone. The medical officer found him trying to stand, trying to get up, blood soaking through his flight suit from 2 wounds. Gunn said he needed to check on his aircraft, needed to see if his planes had been hit. The doctor, a captain from Chicago, said he needed surgery immediately. Gunn made it 30 feet on his own before he collapsed from blood loss, his legs giving out beneath him. They evacuated him to the hospital at Leyte on a jeep, holding pressure on the wounds, trying to keep him conscious. The leg wound was serious, potentially crippling. The shrapnel had severed an artery. The surgeon worked for 3 hours to repair the damage, to save the leg, to save the man. The surgeon said Gunn wouldn't fly again for 6 months minimum, probably longer, possibly never. The injuries qualified him for medical retirement. 45 years old, 26 years of service between the Navy and Army Air Force. He'd earned the right to go home, to rest, to let someone else finish the fight, to let younger men carry on. He'd done enough, more than enough. Gunn told the surgeon he wasn't going anywhere until his family was free. The surgeon didn't argue. He'd heard about Gunn, about his family, about why he flew. Everyone had heard. The Battle of Manila started on February 3rd, 1945. American forces fought house to house through the city, street by street, building by building. The Japanese had declared Manila a fortress, a city they would defend to the last man. They would defend every street, every building, every room. The fighting was brutal, as bad as anything in Europe. Building by building, block by block, room by room. The city was being destroyed in the process of being liberated. Ancient churches burned. Hospitals became battlefields. Civilians died by the thousands, caught between 2 armies. Santo Tomas internment camp was liberated on February 3rd. The first day of the battle, 1st Cavalry Division crashed through the gates. 3,700 Allied prisoners freed after 3 years of captivity. Gunn's wife Polly weighed 89 pounds. She'd weighed 130 pounds when he'd last seen her. His daughter Julia weighed 63 pounds at age 15. They'd been eating rice and vegetable soup once a day for the past year, sometimes less. His son Nathaniel had malaria, shaking with fever. His youngest daughter had dysentery, dehydrated, weak. But they were alive. Against all odds, they were alive. Gunn flew to Manila on February 4th against medical orders, his leg still bandaged and painful. He was using a cane to walk. The doctor had cleared him for light duty only. No flying, no combat. Definitely no flying to an active combat zone where fighting was still ongoing. Gunn went anyway. Nobody could stop him. Nobody tried very hard. He found his family in the makeshift hospital the Army had set up in Santo Tomas, in what had been the main gymnasium. Polly didn't recognize him at first. He'd lost 40 pounds since she'd last seen him in April 1942, 3 years ago, a lifetime ago. He was completely gray now, his hair white. His face was lined and weathered from thousands of hours in open cockpits, from stress, from 3 years of constant worry, from not knowing if they were alive or dead. She thought he was a doctor coming to examine her, just another American officer in a ward full of sick prisoners. Then he said her name, just her name, Polly, and she knew. She recognized his voice, even though she didn't recognize his face. They held each other and cried, and neither one could speak. The official Army report stated that Colonel Paul I. Gunn was reunited with his family on February 4, 1945, at Santo Tomas internment camp, Manila, Philippines. The reunion lasted 4 hours. Then Gunn returned to Leyte. His medical leave wasn't over, but the war wasn't either. There was still work to do. There was always more work to do. The modified B-25 seconds kept flying. Other pilots now, other crews, younger men. But they were flying Gunn's modifications, using Gunn's tactics, building on what he'd pioneered. By the end of the war in August 1945, North American aviation had built 9,600 B-25 Mitchell bombers. Nearly 5,000 were strafer variants, with forward gun packages based on Gunn's original design, based on what he'd welded together in Brisbane in August 1942. Those strafers sank over 800 Japanese ships in the Pacific. They destroyed over 2,000 Japanese aircraft on the ground. They killed an estimated 85,000 Japanese soldiers. The commerce destroyer concept that engineers had called impossible, that every expert said couldn't work, had become the most effective anti-shipping weapon in the theater, had become the weapon that made victory possible. Subscribe to this channel if you're enjoying these stories. We're halfway through Pappy Gunn's story, and there's still more to tell. Hit that subscribe button, because we're going to keep bringing you forgotten stories from World War II. Stories about innovation, about determination, about people who refuse to give up. These stories matter. They deserve to be remembered. All right, let's finish this. Gunn never flew combat again after his wounds at Tacloban. The leg wound ended his operational career. The Army retired him as a full colonel on June 30th, 1948. Medical disability. Honorable discharge. He was 48 years old, still young, still capable. He went back to the Philippines and rebuilt Philippine Airlines, the company he'd started before the war, the company the Japanese had destroyed. The airline resumed operations in 1946. Gunn started with 3 war-surplus C-47 transport aircraft, bought cheap from the military, and rebuilt them himself. He flew routes between Manila, Cebu, Davao, and other Philippine cities. The airline he'd built with 5 Beechcraft planes before the war now operated across the entire archipelago, carrying passengers and cargo, rebuilding the economy. The Philippine government awarded him the Distinguished Service Star in 1947. President Manuel Roxas presented the medal personally at a ceremony in Manila. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and exceptional service to the Republic of the Philippines during the Liberation Campaign." Colonel Gunn's innovative modifications to Allied aircraft directly contributed to the defeat of Japanese forces and the freedom of the Filipino people. The United States military had already decorated him extensively. Distinguished Flying Cross with Oak Leaf Cluster, Silver Star, Legion of Merit, Air Medal, 9 Purple Hearts from wounds received in combat. The Distinguished Service Cross was recommended by General Kenny, but never approved. Some officers in Washington believed Gunn's contributions were technical rather than tactical, engineering rather than combat leadership. They were wrong, completely wrong. General Kenny wrote in his memoir, published in 1949, Pappy Gunn was the most valuable man in the 5th Air Force. His mechanical genius and combat innovations changed the course of the war in the Southwest Pacific. Without his strafer modifications, the Battle of Bismarck Sea would have been a Japanese victory. Without Bismarck Sea, we would have lost New Guinea. Without New Guinea, the road to the Philippines would have been impossible. The entire campaign depended on stopping Japanese reinforcements, and Pappy Gunn gave us the weapon to do it. General MacArthur agreed and said so publicly. In a classified letter to the War Department dated July 1945, MacArthur recommended Gunn for promotion to Brigadier General for recognition of his contributions. The recommendation was denied. The Army Air Force was reducing force structure after the war ended. Promotions were frozen except for academy graduates and regular officers. Gunn remained a colonel. He never complained. He never mentioned it. He'd gotten what he fought for. His family was free. The Philippines were liberated. The Japanese were defeated. That was enough. Philippine Airlines expanded through the late 1940s and early 1950s as the Philippines rebuilt from the devastation of war. Gunn acquired DC-3 aircraft, then DC-4 seconds, then modern Convair 340 seconds. The airline established international routes to Hong Kong, Bangkok, Singapore, cities that had been enemy territory just a few years earlier. By 1956, Philippine Airlines was flying to San Francisco, connecting the Philippines to America, completing a circle that had started before the war. Gunn flew constantly, more than any other executive in the airline. Manila to Cebu, Cebu to Davao, Davao to Hong Kong, Hong Kong to Manila. He couldn't stop. He didn't know how to stop. The war had taught him that movement meant survival, that staying active meant staying alive. Standing still meant death. Some of his pilots said Gunn was still fighting, still outrunning something. Maybe the memory of Santo Tomas. Maybe the faces of the men who'd flown his modified aircraft and never came back. Maybe the ghosts of the Bismarck Sea. War does that to people. It changes you in ways you can't always articulate, in ways that never fully heal. On October 10, 1957, Gunn chartered a Beechcraft Model 18 twin-engine plane for a personal trip. He was flying from Manila to Baguio, a mountain resort city 140 miles north. A routine trip. He'd made it hundreds of times. The weather forecast showed scattered thunderstorms over the Cordillera Mountains, but nothing severe, nothing unusual for October. He filed his flight plan at 0800 hours. Departure time 0930. Expected arrival 1100 hours. The tower cleared him for takeoff at 0928. The weather deteriorated faster than forecast, faster than anyone expected. By 10:30, the Cordillera Mountains were completely socked in. Heavy rain, near zero visibility, severe turbulence, the kind of weather that grounds aircraft. The Beechcraft's radio went silent at 10:47. The last transmission was Gunn reporting moderate turbulence and requesting clearance to climb to 8,000 feet to get above the weather. Search and rescue teams found the wreckage 3 days later on a mountainside near Baguio at 6,000 feet elevation. The aircraft had flown into a severe storm cell. The pilots had tried to climb above it, tried to get above the turbulence. The winds, severe downdrafts, drove them into the ridge. The impact killed everyone instantly. There were no survivors. Paul Irwin Gunn died on October 11, 1957. He was 57 years old, 58 in 1 week. He would have been 58 years old in 1 week. The Philippine government gave him a state funeral with full military honors. 6,000 people attended, lining the streets of Manila. American veterans who'd flown with him, who'd served with him. Philippine Airlines employees who'd worked for him. Former prisoners from Santo Tomas who knew their freedom had been bought by men like Gunn, who remembered. General Kenny sent a wreath from the United States with a note that said simply, "To Pappy, you gave us the weapon we needed." The Manila Times published Gunn's obituary on October 12, 1957. The headline read, "War Hero Dies in Plane Crash." The article mentioned his distinguished flying cross, his role in the Battle of Bismarck Sea, his liberation missions over the Philippines, but it couldn't capture what he'd actually done. Words weren't enough. They never are. The numbers told part of the story. 5,000 B-25 strafers built with his modifications. 800 Japanese ships sunk using his tactics. 2,000 aircraft destroyed on the ground. 85,000 enemy soldiers killed. Those were the official statistics. The numbers that go in the history books. The numbers that get reported. But the real impact was different. The strafer concept changed how air forces thought about bombers, changed doctrine, changed tactics. Before Gunn, bombers dropped ordnance from altitude. They were strategic weapons, designed to attack factories and railroads and cities, designed for destruction from above. After Gunn, bombers became multi-role weapons: strafing, skip bombing, close air support, precision attack. The bomber became a tactical asset, something that could directly support troops on the ground or ships at sea. The AC-130 gunship used in Vietnam, with its side-firing guns and devastating firepower, was a direct descendant of Gunn's B-25 modifications. So was the A-10 Warthog with its massive 30mm cannon designed to destroy tanks. So is every modern attack aircraft with forward-firing guns, every close air support platform. Gunn's innovation became the foundation for an entire category of military aircraft that exists to this day. North American Aviation hired Gunn as a consulting engineer in 1948 after his retirement. He worked on the B-25 Tornado jet bomber, the first American jet bomber. He advised on gun mounting systems. He designed forward-firing armament packages. The company paid him well, paid him consultant rates. He gave most of the money to veteran organizations, to programs that helped former POWs adjust to civilian life, to scholarships for the children of men who hadn't come home, men who died flying his modified aircraft. His son Nathaniel joined the Air Force after college, following in his father's footsteps. He flew B-52 seconds in Vietnam. He retired as a colonel, the same rank his father had achieved. In 1994, Nathaniel wrote a book about his father titled Pappy Gunn, an American Hero. The book sold 12,000 copies over several years. Most people had never heard of Paul Gunn before reading that book. The book is out of print now, hard to find even in used bookstores or online. Fewer than 1,000 copies still exist. The National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, displays one of Gunn's original gun mounting drawings in a small exhibit case. The paper is yellowed and brittle with age. The measurements are handwritten in pencil, with corrections and notes in the margins in Gunn's handwriting. The sketch shows 4 .50 caliber guns mounted inside an A-20 nose compartment. No stress calculations, no computer modeling, no wind tunnel data, no engineering stamps. Just a drawing, a simple sketch that changed naval warfare in the Pacific and killed 8,000 Japanese soldiers at the Battle of Bismarck Sea. The Air Force Association inducted Gunn into the Air Force Enlisted Heritage Hall in 2008, 51 years after his death. The citation mentioned his innovations, his combat record, his influence on modern attack aviation. The ceremony was held in Washington, D.C. 3 of his grandchildren attended. Most people at the ceremony had never heard of him before that day. Most people at a ceremony honoring him didn't know who he was. Philippine Airlines still operates today. The airline flies to 42 destinations across Asia, Australia, and North America. The company headquarters in Manila has a portrait of Gunn in the main lobby, a formal military photograph showing him in his colonel's uniform with his medals. Most employees walk past it every day and don't know who he is. They don't know his story. They don't know that the man in the photograph saved their country and changed the course of World War II in the Pacific. That's what happens to heroes sometimes. Time passes. Memories fade. The people who knew them die. The stories get forgotten. New generations come along who never heard the stories, who don't know the history. That's why channels like this exist. That's why these videos matter. That's why your engagement matters. If this story moved you, if you found it interesting, if you learned something you didn't know before, do me one final favor. Subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who appreciates military history. Post it on Facebook or Twitter or wherever you hang out online. Send it to your dad, your grandfather, anyone who served, or anyone who appreciates what these men did. Because the only way these stories survive is if people like you and me keep sharing them, keep engaging with them, keep telling YouTube that this content matters. The algorithm doesn't care about Pappy Gunn. The algorithm doesn't care about history. The algorithm cares about engagement metrics, about watch time and clicks and shares. But we can use the algorithm to keep these memories alive. We can game the system to preserve history. So subscribe. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Tell us if you had family members who served in World War II. Tell us if you knew about Pappy Gunn before this video. Just let us know you're here and that these stories matter to you. Because they should matter. These men deserve to be remembered. Paul Gunn started this story as a naval officer, trying to save his family from a Japanese prison camp. He ended it as the man who changed how air forces use bombers in combat. He proved that impossible is just a word, that sometimes the guy with grease under his fingernails knows more than the guy with a degree on the wall, that determination and ingenuity can overcome any obstacle, any expert opinion, any conventional wisdom. The engineers at Wright Field said his gunship wouldn't work. They were wrong. The Japanese thought bad weather would protect their convoys. They were wrong. The textbooks said submarines couldn't sink destroyers, and bombers couldn't strafe ships, and field modifications couldn't compete with factory engineering. They were all wrong. Every single expert was wrong. Pappy Gunn didn't care what the textbooks said. He didn't care what was supposed to be impossible. He had a family to save and a war to win, and he wasn't going to let anyone tell him it couldn't be done. Not the engineers at Wright Field, not the Japanese Navy, not the laws of aerodynamics. Nothing was going to stop him. That's the real lesson here. Not the technical details of gun mounts and center of gravity calculations. Not the specifics of skip, bombing, or masthead attacks. The lesson is that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to give up, when they keep pushing forward, even when everyone says it's impossible, when they have a reason that matters more than their own safety or comfort. Thank you for watching. Thank you for helping us keep these memories alive. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen. You're part of preserving history just by being here, just by watching, just by caring enough to listen to a story about a guy most people have never heard of. Now go hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories like this, more forgotten heroes, more impossible achievements that need to be remembered, and we're going to keep telling them as long as people like you keep listening. Pappy Gunn changed the war. He saved countless lives. He brought his family home, and he did it all with some welding equipment, stolen guns, and a refusal to accept impossible as an answer. That's worth remembering.